want to. I think this is how love goes.
It is 9:20 right here in the heart of the River Bend on this 13th day of February. We're getting closer to Valentine's Day, but, you know, with so many things that are going on in my life, you know, with pro wrestling and being a high school athlete and so many things, you know, some of that wear and tear is starting to hit me, some of the city miles. And I was sitting there thinking, you know, there's so many times that maybe, you know, I kind of worry about my eyesight too with concussions and taking some falls on the wrestling mat. So what better time to talk about this than now with Dr. Julie Steinhauer, who's now in her 22nd year of practice, visionforlifeworks.com. She specializes in vision-related learning problems such as sports vision, rehabilitative optometry, and so much more. Dr. Steinhauer, save me before I have to start talking about more medical terms. How are you today?
Good morning. Good morning.
Joining us by audio, Dr. Steinhauer. I was trying my best there. I was the little engine that could. It just optometry kind of fooled me.
That's okay, CJ. Thank you so much. I appreciate your having me on the show today.
Well, and I really appreciate you. There's no better way to break the ice than to just kind of see if it works, you know, see if it sticks. But I really appreciate this. You're really busy, and to take time out of your day to join us means a lot. And I just got to ask you right off the bat, so this is your 22nd year of practice?
It is. Yeah, it's hard to believe. I was calculating when you said that. I was like, oh my gosh, 22? Is it really that many years?
That's incredible. So how did this start? Where did you always have kind of an interest in eye-related issues? Was that something that you kind of found as early on in your life, or is that an interest you kind of developed as you were in your course of study?
Well, you know, I would love to just say that I felt like I was designed to do this my entire life. However, that's just not really the case. I initially intended to be a pediatrician. And when I was in college, you know, I paused and I thought about that a little bit. And I thought, I really don't like school that much. I don't think I want to go for another however many years. So to be honest, it was not real fantastic. But what I did was I started looking at, well, what can I do in 4 years in the medical kind of genre? And so as I did that, I looked around and I thought, you know, various things within the body. I'm not real interested in all of those things. Eyes doesn't sound too bad. And that's how it happened.
I love it. Sorry, I just love that story.
So I would love to say that vision was something that called me from the very beginning. And in some ways, maybe it did. Just I didn't really have that awareness at my forefront early on. So I jumped into vision. I went and I started looking at various offices. I started following and shadowing a lot of doctors. I got into optometry school in Missouri at UMSL, and that was a blessing. But it probably wasn't until about my 3rd to 4th year, after I had already picked all of my external rotations that I was doing in my 4th year of school, and they were all disease related, that I came to realize I actually hated disease management. So another faulty area of decision making. And I really realized at that point that I did have a passion still for working with kids. And I wanted to see how could I marry optometry and working with kids. And that's where vision therapy, vision development, helping kids who are struggling in school, that's where it really came from. And so my last year, because I had chosen a lot of disease rotations and I was stuck, I couldn't really alter that schedule. I had to go out on my own. So in between, on weekends, I would go visit other practices that had large and successful vision therapy practices working with children. And that's kind of how it really got started for me.
That's incredible. And I mean, it's really cool to hear too that, you know, because so many times I feel like when I interview, you know, doctors or anyone and I talk about the background, it seems like the common answer is, oh yeah, I've always wanted to do this. But to hear that is really kind of because my mom and grandma both started out in the pediatric side as well too. So it's kind of interesting to see how a lot of people's medical journeys start. Um,
Absolutely.
and I think it's really important, especially because that what you said too, and what I've kind of read up about you, it kind of hits close to home because I was kind of in middle school. Was starting to have trouble focusing. And I was starting to I just in class, my eyes weren't really focusing. My head was hurting all the time. And we didn't know what was going on. So I had to go to the eye doctor and I found out I had all these, kind of lingering eye issues and got some glasses and it really fixed me up and helped me kind of achieve more in school because I could actually see everything and not have to refocus my eyes every 10 seconds. Is that kind of some of the stuff that you tend to help, with individuals and stuff that's more serious than what I just described?
Yeah, absolutely. So, really, what happens when we have kids that are referred to our practice or that come to our practice, there's a couple different modes that occurs. Sometimes they're coming because a specific diagnosis they've received from their local eye doctor. So, something like strabismus, which is an eye turn, or amblyopia, where they don't see well, and maybe it could be convergence insufficiency where they have trouble focusing and lining their two eyes up together as a team. So sometimes they come with a specific diagnosis, and sometimes it's more along the lines of they find us one way or another because they're struggling in school and they're not doing well, or they don't like to read, or their performance is not matching up to what the parents believe they have as what their potential is. And so if that's the case, then they find me one way or another. We're real fortunate then to start working with kids. Typically at that point, we realize it's usually a little bit more than glasses, particularly if they come in with a specific diagnosis. We're going to maybe look at glasses, but that's not the fix for it. And so what we do is we look at, well, what are the entering problems with their vision, and what do we need to do to correct those things? Almost like retraining the brain and forming new brainwave patterns around this visual system to help them to perform better and be successful in school.
That is really just such a fascinating topic. And honestly, that has to be rewarding for you as well to see a student that or an individual that's really struggling and not getting that fulfillment. And you being able to work with, she or him and being able to kind of transform that is really just has to be something special.
Absolutely. Our students that we work with, they will jump anywhere from 3 to 7 grade levels in reading ability during the time that they've
Wow.
gone through our program. So if we have kids that we know that they're smart, but they're really challenged maybe in the classroom, or they just don't like to read, or they're struggling and they're behind with reading. I hear really on a frequent basis of parents saying, he's really, really smart, or she's super, super smart, but we just can't get this book thing figured out. We just can't quite get the grasp on the reading that we need to get. And so by correcting how their eyes line up with their brains and using them together as a team for the brain to process that information, that's what's really enabling them to achieve, jumping ahead as opposed to being behind or catching up. So sometimes it's not about jumping ahead, but gosh, just to get the kids to catch up to the grade level of where they need to be. We had a story of a child who graduated our program just last 2 weeks ago, actually. And when he entered into our program, he wasn't even reading at his age. And so he was behind significantly. I think he was at the end of first to second grade or so. And he jumped then up to the middle of a second grade reading level. And so he's reading and performing better. He's still a little bit behind, but what we tend to find out is that even after kids graduate our program, typically within the first 6 months, they'll jump ahead. So we expect in about the next 6 months, he'll jump probably another grade to 2 in his reading ability.
That's incredible. I mean, that really is incredible. And I'm going to ask you a little bit more about the program just as a whole here in a couple of seconds. But I got to ask you this. This is something that I've been kind of thinking about. And with you, with your, expertise in this, it's no better time to ask. With COVID, so many students, sitting at home, they're on Zoom. Did that, kind of raise more awareness, do you think, with parents going, maybe there's something, wrong with my child's eyes, or did it have any effect on eye-related issues when it came to that excess of screen time?
Absolutely. We saw an explosion of kids having binocular or two-eyed vision problems as a result of all of the extra time on iPads or Zoom meetings or whatever it was that they were doing for their individual school needs. And even kids who were in our program at the time that were nearing the end of their completion of the program, we really had to go back and start over in some areas because the strain was so hard on their visual systems. It really just caused a lot of kids to kind of visually crash with their binocular systems. And I think it did raise awareness as patients or parents all around were, even all around the world, were saying, what's going on? Since we've been on the computer so much, my child is really struggling. And I think the other thing is too, that really it was an awareness of the parents where they're seeing their kids on a daily basis and what was happening with them as well. So I think it came from multiple fronts, but it definitely brought attention to a lot of vision problems.
That is really just so fascinating because I think as years go on and we start learning more about, the COVID years in terms of like education, especially for younger students, I just want to see kind of more of those studies and correlations in both health and the mental aspect. I just find it, kind of intriguing. But Dr. Steinhauer, I got to ask you more about this program. This sounds like a very innovative, very involved program to really help get us back on the path. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So our program is split into two phases. The first phase is what we would like to call an activation phase, where we are electrically stimulating the brain to start processing things differently. We're electrically stimulating the brain to basically create like new neural pathways. And the way that we're doing that is through a system called syntonics or photo light therapy. They are glasses that are specialized, filters that are worn. They have different colored lenses that when a person wears them and looks at a light for a prescribed amount of time, and it's actually a fairly small prescribed amount of time. It's usually somewhere around 7 to 14 minutes per day. It starts electrically reprogramming their brain for better success with vision. And then in phase two, we continue that process, but now we add the hands-on component where they either come into our office or they may be working with one of our therapists online with various tools and instruments where we're teaching them how to align and use their two eyes better, track better, so they're gaining better binocularity and use of the two eyes together. And the system that we started, it's kind of actually really interesting because out of the COVID year in 2020, I decided to sit down and develop my program fully on how was I actually going to work with patients who had either traumatic brain injuries, were struggling in school, maybe lost vision. And so I came up with a program or a protocol that's specific to our office on how to use the syntonics that works with how the brain heals itself and then begins to lay new neural pathways and then really works to achieve the binocularity of using the brain to work with two eyes together. And so I spent a lot of hours on it, actually. It probably consumed about 40 to 50 or so of my hours developing this program and then making a user-friendly program that doctors would also be able to learn how to utilize.
That is incredible. And that's something I honestly I always ask kind of the pandemic question to see how it affects individuals. And I completely forgot to ask you, but that's really, really insightful because you're using, the best of your time, number one. But I also didn't even think about, trying to educate and advance a course with individuals during that time. That's quite fascinating.
Yeah, well, there was quite a few things I think that were born out of that time frame, and a lot of them were efficiencies for our office and practice. We had a certain volume of patients or potential patients reaching out to us on a monthly basis prior to everything happening with COVID, and we are talking in that time frame of prior to March 2020. And then around about August of 2020, we noticed, wow, we had about a tripling of the number of people reaching out to us. And then within about another month or so, it tripled to quadrupled again from that time. And so I was spending anywhere from 5 to 9 hours a day just answering emails and fielding questions from people contacting us from all over the world. So we had to put some automated systems in place to even help me out because on top of it, I'm like, well, I need to eat, sleep, and, have my family time and see patients in my clinic. And I didn't even have time for that. So we did put some systems in place. And then at the same time, I was working on this, particular protocol for other doctors who are vision development and binocular vision doctors and traumatic brain injury working doctors so that they would be able to be successful like we've been using this specific protocol of syntonics.
Wow. I'm speechless. I mean, I am really speechless. That's just really incredible. And Dr. Steinhauer, you do such great work. I have a few more questions for you involving, concussions. Because I know I'm kind of switching gears here, but I want to make sure we get all these answered in the time frame that we have, because this is something that really does kind of circle back to me. I do professional wrestling with the chairs and, getting dropped on your head every once in a while, but I never realized just the effects that concussions could have on my eyesight. Can you take us through some of the things that, and, maybe some of the issues that do arise from some of these concussions and eye-related issues?
Absolutely. So head injuries, concussions, whiplash, even simple things like we don't think about it, but cracking our head on, maybe the hatchback of the car or something like that. These are simple things. And then, of course, we think about really serious injuries where the person maybe loses consciousness or they may have to be in the hospital. Maybe they are even in a coma because of a traumatic brain injury. So there's a lot of different variety of what actually is a traumatic brain injury. But if we discuss what kinds of visual problems come out of that, is very diverse. So there can be things like strabismus where they develop an eye turn. Certainly we know there are very common things like light sensitivity, maybe stimulation or overstimulation to sounds and sensory input that they can't tolerate as much as they could before. And just a sense of overwhelm for many patients who've had some level of traumatic brain injury. Other things are when they go to read, they might notice that the print is moving and wiggling on the page or even doubling up, where maybe they are even just struggling with being able to see the print on the page. And other things would be, headaches, difficulty staying focused. That's one of the number one things that I hear is I just can't stay focused after I've had my head injury. And, that's really a challenging and a difficult thing for many patients to be able to deal with, especially if they were avid readers or did well in school, or if it's associated with a job that you're doing, and then all of a sudden after this traumatic brain injury, you can't quite do the things that you were doing before. So that's a real big challenge.
Absolutely. And I mean, what I think is so fascinating about all the great work that you do is that it encompasses so many different individuals, and it's a wide ranging amount of services you provide, whether it's, someone that's in school, maybe it's a child, or even an individual that's recovering from a stroke, and I wanted to ask you about that too, because that's something, again, that I've had to deal with in terms of, older relatives that do have, have had strokes, and then the kind of road to recovery seems a little bit more tough as the older they are. Take us through some of the things that we need to look out for. If maybe a loved one does have a stroke, is there ways we can tell if their vision's affected, even though they aren't really telling us too much, after that recovery?
Yeah, it can be really tricky for some, depending upon where the area of the stroke occurred in the brain, because sometimes their thinking processes are not exactly the same as they were before. So those can be altered after they've had a stroke. Maybe their memory is also faltering, and there may be other things, it may have affected their movements, so their ability to walk or talk. And so there are so many different things that happen after stroke. Oftentimes the visual aspect is somewhat overlooked or on the back burner unless the individual is really aware and cognizant enough to speak it out. Sometimes that's something that's not found until months down the road, which is a problem. Most of the time what we hear is that, if they are cognizant, they're really aware, and it only occurred maybe at the back of the brain where the occipital lobe is, then they will definitely be aware of their visual deficit, and they're going to speak that out. If you don't have that and you have someone who is impaired in other ways, the only way that you can really tell is you may notice them neglecting one half of their body. So it's called visual neglect when they do that, and they may neglect one half of their face, or they may run into things if they have mobility and they are able to get up and walk around. So there are some things that you can look for visually to see that. And then what we say is, this is not something you really want to wait on. If you put them through cognitive therapy or speech therapy or occupational therapy in order to recover some ability after stroke, we really want to be putting them through some program for vision recovery as well, which is what we do.
Very, very interesting and fascinating and so insightful. And you know what I like about it, Dr. Steinhauer, is that just speaking with me, you're making it so where I can understand. Because sometimes when I interview doctors, some of the medical terminology comes flying out at me and I have no idea where we are. And I just keep nodding my head and saying yes. And I think that's a big testament to your services too that you provide, is that we aren't going to be confused. We're going to get a straight, forward approach of your plan that you put together, your program. And I think that's really important. Now we have a minute or two left, but I got to ask you, in terms of just the support of the medical community and the individuals that you are associated with, what's the feedback been about this program? Has there been a lot of positive, insightful things from your realm of professionals?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it always depends on what area we're discussing, but in terms of, especially whenever we're talking about stroke and vision recovery, a lot of times what we're hearing is just that neurologists and neuro-ophthalmologists and other doctors who are associated with that team of people after someone's had a stroke is typically along the lines of, wow, we didn't really know, or we didn't really understand how much vision could be recovered. And many times they tell people, just wait and see what happens. The first 6 months after a stroke is the best time frame that your vision will recover. So a lot of these doctors don't even know that you can actively work to recover vision. And it's very important for people to know that. We can work with patients 3 years, 10 years after a stroke and they've lost vision, but I'd much rather work with an individual within that first 6 month time frame. The brain is able to recover things a lot more quickly. And so that's better for the patient overall. But even if it's been years down the road, there is still chance for some vision recovery to occur.
Absolutely. And Dr. Julie Steinhauer, for more information, if individuals down here in Alton are wanting to utilize your services or maybe look more into your program, what's the best way to get that information?
Yeah, so there's a couple of methods. If they're phone callers, give us a call at 618-288-1489. If they happen to not like that method, they want to go look on the back burner a little bit and dig into me a little more, they can feel free to go to our website, which is vision4lifeworks.com. And they have the opportunity there to see quite a lot of the things that we do, our services, our success stories, and they can schedule a consultation right from there.
Absolutely. Dr. Steinhauer, thank you so much for taking about 20 minutes with us here in Alton out of your schedule. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, CJ. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I appreciate you so much. And you are really insightful. I can tell you did some homework ahead of time. And so I really thank you for a great interview.
Thank you very much. And we'll definitely have to have you back on whenever we get the opportunity.
Sounds great.
At 9:43, we're going to take a quick break because Luis Noya is our St. Louis sports correspondent. We get some updates on the Blues, how the Cardinals are looking ahead of spring training. All that and more comes your way next in downtown Alton.